A Washington, D.C. hospital opened a hotline a few days ago, and counselors can barely keep up. In St. Louis, people say the war has reached into their lives.
It's always a threat of a draft, and I'm not going over there to kill nobody, so that's always on my mind.
I'm a little more concerned. I have a lot of family over there, close friends, people that I went to high school with, things like that.
It really brings home a lot of the potential devastating consequences, the expansion of the war, possibility that friends could be drawn into it.
And it's that expansion of the war that has really caused a panic attack.
The threat of terrorism has turned to actuality now that war has broken out in the Mideast.
We feel helpless in this country. A terrorist is an unknown entity that we can't see, we can't fight, and one of the primary causes of intense anxiety and fear is fear of the unknown, fear of the intangible threat.
That anxiety has turned the ordinary events of life into something more. Even on a New York City subway, which can be dangerous in normal times, riders think twice.
But I'm definitely more aware, and it's a conscious thing, walking through the gate and putting in my token, that there might perhaps be a terrorist attack on this very train.
Some people are so jittery about their safety, they've gone beyond thinking about it, they're doing something about it. Even though the experts say that the chances of getting caught up in a terrorist attack are extraordinarily small.
They are scared that something's going to happen here.
At Hodge Army Navy store in Marietta, Georgia, they have sold out of gas masks, and other protective gear is in demand as well.
We had a woman come in and wanted to buy a tent for her baby's crib, like the ones they're using over in Israel.
Steve Nussbaum sells security systems, mostly to corporate executives in Southern California. Since January 15th, business is up 50%.
Right now, a very hot item is a hostage locator tracker, where it's a unit where an individual could actually press it and be in contact with their bodyguard, and bulletproof jackets are very common right now.
It is hard to escape the sense of unease when confronted with security precautions that didn't exist 10 days ago. A big city hotel, unidentified at the hotel's request, now searches luggage left unattended in the lobby.
What constitutes a good search?
A Washington, D.C. security firm is sending out guards as fast as they can hire them to offices throughout the capital.
Unattended baggage will be removed immediately for inspection and may be damaged or destroyed.
As for air travel, there's no longer curbside check-in, and a few corporations are keeping their people off of international flights. Domestic travel has not gone down, but these passengers at the Los Angeles airport are still taking extra care.
I'm making major changes in my seat location because you don't know what's going to happen where you are. But as you walk through the airplane, you think to yourself, well, over here you're near the door, so maybe it's better, maybe it's worse, I don't know.
What are your precautions to take?
Well, you know, don't dress in real American clothes. You know, try and dress down. Like if you're in Europe, dress like a European.
And do you do that?
Yeah, I do now, yeah.
Noticeable to garbage cans or plants, if there's something in them, baggage, you know, by themselves. Definitely wear that.
It would be wrong to suggest that all of America is hunkering down. Case in point, the Super Bowl, which will be played Sunday in Tampa under such extraordinary security that one official called it the safest place in the country. But even before that assessment, Super Bowl tickets were harder to come by than a gas mask. Still, scenes like this have become as real and as uncomfortable as the war itself. This is Jackie Judd for Nightline in Washington.
The man in charge of counterterrorism in the United States is FBI Director William Sessions, who joins us live here in our Washington Bureau. Director Sessions, we just saw those shots of the Super Bowl. I'm told you're the man who has to make the uncomfortable call if for some reason there is a what seems to you to be a legitimate terrorist threat, to possibly even call it off?
Actually, Ted, there is a committee of law enforcement people, including the FBI, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the County Sheriff's Department, the Tampa Police, that are on a joint effort down there, and they are making the calls that are surrounding the preparation and the security for the Super Bowl.
And you are involved directly?
I am involved in the sense that I'm aware of what they're doing and I'm aware of the activities that are taking place, but no, I'm not on that committee.
How fundamentally would that call be made? I mean, on what kind of a basis? You always get kooks who call in and make telephone threats, but you can't empty out the Super Bowl on a telephone threat.
Well, that again would be an evaluation that would be made by that committee and would be looked at by that committee. I'm not privy to their discussions as to precisely the techniques they'll use, but I'm sure they'll be very watchful and they'll be very certain that it is a safe environment for the playing the game.
Well, let me tap into your expertise. Again, the danger at a time like this is that some people get their jollies from scaring other people. How does law enforcement distinguish between the irrelevant threat and the threat that has to be taken seriously? And given the times, I would think that some threats that might not be taken seriously normally would be now.
Well, you placed the problem very, very squarely before me. Obviously, threats have to be evaluated, and the constant threat evaluation that's made by law enforcement agencies allows us to make an educated guess and allows us to make an analysis of the circumstance to see about the truthfulness of it, the character of the notice we're given, all the facts that surround and come into the mix.
You're not going to want to scare people. By the same token, the last thing the FBI wants to do is to be held responsible a month from now if there has been a rash of terrorist threats. So there are all kinds of balances that have to be maintained here.
That's correct.
For example, there was a story in the Los Angeles Times yesterday that suggests that you may have information that some Iraqi diplomats are using their diplomatic pouches, or that other diplomats may have been using their diplomatic pouches, which, as you know, are essentially sacrosanct, to smuggle in devices that could be used for terrorism. What do you do at a time like that?
Well, Ted, of course, what you do is take all the information that you can gain and you make an analysis of it and try to deal with it appropriately under the guidelines of the Attorney General that guide us in our terrorism investigation. Of course, with any specific circumstance that is suggested, you simply want to be sure that you leave no source of information unturned and untested, and that analysis continues. And it's not as if we're in a vacuum. The FBI has had a counterterrorism mission since 1982 as a priority, and systematically we review the intelligence that we gain through the law enforcement agencies, through the cooperation of the American people. The flow of information is extremely helpful, and I would say that that will happen in all these circumstances.
I want to continue our conversation, Judge Sessions, and when we come back, what I'd like to ask you about is the balance between the kind of protections that we normally enjoy under the Constitution and what happens to those in what is, after all, a time of war. We'll be back with Judge Sessions in a moment, and later in the broadcast, we'll review some of the facts and figures that have surfaced after 10 days of war. We'll talk with the chief spokesman of the Israeli Defense Forces and with a journalist just back from Baghdad. We'll also assess the damage caused by the Gulf oil spill with the science advisor to King Hussein of Jordan.
LensCrafters made my state-of-the-art glasses in just under an hour, so I could see better and perform better fast.
LensCrafters puts the whole lab right in the store to custom craft your top quality glasses in about an hour. Call LensCrafters at 1-800-522-LENS.
No one can guarantee you a perfect world. A world where the unexpected never intrudes. Some of us know we'll be taken care of, quickly and compassionately. In an imperfect world, you're in good hands with Allstate, a member of the Sears Financial Network.
Okay, listen up, people. It's Super Bucks weekend at Sears, and that means you decide what's on sale. Just grab the coupons from your newspaper for savings up to $50. So bring the coupons to Sears and let's shop!
And Nissan wins the score. Baja Internacional here in Ensenada.
Another first for Nissan at the HDRA fireworks.
Once again in Las Vegas, the winner is Nissan. And the competition eats dust.
If you want the dirt on 4x4, Nissan's SE V6 King Cab boasts the most powerful import brand V6 in its class.
Gold Coast 300 is history, and the winner is Nissan.
No wonder it's cleaning up.
Nissan, and it's not even close.
Nissan, it's more than a truck. It's an attitude.
Welcome to El Torito's sizzling Fajitas Fiesta. Our famous steak or chicken fajitas with your choice of a taco, an enchilada, taquitos, and more. All for just $7.95. Our sizzling fajitas combinations. When we're hot, we're hot. Get free nachos with any of El Torito's $7.95 fajita combos.
David Brinkley here. On our This Week program Sunday, we'll hear thoughts, opinions, and maybe predictions on the war from officials of Israel and the White House. Sunday at a special time.
And we are back live now with FBI Director William Sessions. Judge Sessions, I rather suspect it was intentional, but I don't recall getting a direct answer from you on the question about those diplomatic pouches. Do you have any information that diplomats are using those?
I would not discuss any particular investigation, Ted, nor discuss the existence of it. And so if that were the case, I wouldn't discuss it with you.
I rather thought it was intentional. All right, let's talk for a moment. You probably recall from reading your history books that during the Civil War, President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. There are times, during times of war, when some of the constitutional rights of our citizenry go by the board. The FBI has been criticized, as you know, over the last few weeks because Arab Americans, in particularly those of Iraqi origin, feel that they have been unfairly singled out and questioned by some of your agents. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Oh, several things. First of all, this is not a time of suspension of anybody's constitutional rights and must not be taken that way, nor tolerated, nor allowed. It's absolutely essential that people understand that we are contacting thousands of law enforcement agencies, thousands of people who can help give information, corporations who are concerned about security, concerned about these aspects of potential terrorism. But as to the very basic tenet of the sanctity of the constitutional rights, they must not be in any way violated. As to the interviews and conversations that have taken place with the Arab Americans, they have been by and large very, very cordial. We have been very well received. They know we're concerned about the potential backlash against that particular segment of our American population. It's absolutely essential that these voluntary type interviews be connoted for what they are, and that is an effort to be sure that there's no circumstance uncovered that might help us in leading to terrorism acts of terrorism that might be avoided by proper conversation.
You say voluntary.
Oh, they are all voluntary, absolutely.
If, in other words, I were an Arab American and an FBI agent came to me and said, I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Koppel, about, your background and possibly some information you might be able to give us, I would be fully within my rights to say thank you, but no thank you?
Absolutely, and what you should say is, I prefer not to. Thank you. And that is the end of it.
Would it really be the end of it, or would it just make me the object of greater suspicion?
Oh, no, quite to the contrary. Any of those interviews are absolutely voluntary, as they are with all citizens. And the point is that the ability to assist our citizens in understanding that we know that there may be backlash against a particular segment is extremely important. Tonight, as I was coming down here, I came by the Iraqi embassy, and I saw the guards out there and the police out there trying to be sure that that particular embassy was protected. Again, under our American way of life, it's absolutely essential that we understand that the police are here to help us. The FBI is here to help us and to help people cope with what is actually a very difficult time where a man, as President Bush has said, intends to carry terrorism around the world, and we are seeing those things come to pass.
Let me ask you then how seriously you take that threat insofar as the United States of America is concerned.
I take it very seriously, Ted, but I do it in a framework of being able to prepare for it. And I think the American people should take great confidence from the fact that their police forces are, in fact, alert, and that their industries are very carefully preparing to be sure that those things that can be done to avoid a terroristic act being effective are taken. For instance, I saw on the show tonight the discussions about the airlines. I think the steps that they've taken are very logical and are protective of their customers. Those people who are traveling are entitled to rely that the industry does take those kinds of precautions which will ensure that the possibility of a terrorist act will not hit home in that industry.
You have been at great pains, and so have I, not to be alarmist. I would like to ask you if there is anything that the average American citizen can do in going about their own lives, certain precautions that people ought to be taking, simple ones that you'd like to list for us now.
Well, when I was watching your film tonight, I couldn't help but think back about World War II and the concern about espionage and the awareness that was encouraged on the part of our governmental authorities for the American people to be alert and to be attentive and to share information with the authorities if there was a circumstance that they thought might be leading to espionage or might be leading to those things which would be detrimental to the American interest. And I would say tonight the American people should do the same thing. They should understand that terrorism can, of course, strike anywhere, but that alert people, helpful people, people passing information about unusual things they see or things that might be directed at the American people in the form of a terroristic act should be shared with the police, should be shared with the FBI, and by those means we will obviously be able, hopefully, to avert those circumstances.
There is one very fundamental question, and you've been very kind to come in so late. I'll let you go right after this.
If I don't go to sleep, you'll be all right, Ted.
Are we safe?
I think we are safe. I think we are prepared. The FBI, since the war started in April, well, since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August, has been consistently preparing for the possibility there would be war and that Mr. Hussein would try to bring that in the form of terrorism to America. And we are prepared. The police are prepared. Obviously, many governmental agencies are doing their best to be sure that they are alert, that they are, as I say, fully aerobic. That is, that the information flows easily and smoothly between the law enforcement agencies. So I think we're in good shape.
Judge Sessions, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
When we return, a review of today's Gulf War news, and joining us, the man responsible for alerting Israelis to Scud missile attacks.
An Iraqi Scud missile penetrated Allied defenses, struck an office building, killing one person and injuring at least 30. In Israel, 7 Iraqi Scuds sliced through the darkening skies just as the Jewish Sabbath was beginning. Patriot missiles hit some of the Scuds, but missed or failed to stop others. One Patriot rose and then appeared to fall directly back to Earth. Debris and warheads showered down on northern and central Israel, leaving at least one person dead and more than 60 injured. Earlier in the day, the news delivered by 4 Allied commanders in Riyadh, British, French, Saudi, and American, was all good. Better weather, more effective bombing, Saddam Hussein's military communications hampered, and 51 more of his soldiers now prisoners of war, captured on a tiny island, Qura, in telling condition.
A large number, if not all of the Iraqi EPWs are covered with lice, and they have some open sores, and some, if not all, report having pretty slim rations, a few saying that they're down to 1 meal a day.
All Iraqi prisoners of war, the general said, are being treated according to the Geneva Conventions, in contrast to the apparent mistreatment of captured Allied airmen, 3 more of whom were brought before Baghdad TV cameras today. An Iraqi government spokesman says this manipulation of captured flyers will stop. But there was no stopping Iraq's spillage of millions of gallons of crude oil into the northern Persian Gulf from tankers and a major Kuwaiti pumping station offshore. As the 2-by-10-mile oil slick slid southward toward Saudi Arabia, concern rose about a potential ecological disaster and the threat to Allied water supplies, but probably no military complications.
If I look into my 34 and a quarter years before the colors, I can find nothing that would make any sense militarily in releasing several million barrels of oil into the Persian Gulf. As a matter of fact, it makes about as much sense militarily as shooting Scud missiles into population centers.
Edward Battalato, who used to head security for the U.S. Department of Energy, says capping the spill may be impossible and controlling it will be difficult.
Trying to cap it is so difficult because the sources are in enemy hands. Spills of this size are 4 options. You can boom it, contain it, and then mechanically pick it up. You can burn it. You can also biodegrade it, or you can put dispersants on it.
Battolato says there may be worse to come.
If, in fact, he puts more in, if it gets to be the full capacity he has, the 25 million barrels, there's nothing we can do.
At the White House, questions about what to do about Saddam Hussein. Should the Allies escalate their war aims to include his death?
No, I'm staying with our objectives. And the violation of the Geneva Conventions are clear, and we'll have to see how that works out. Have to see what a post-liberation Kuwait looks like there in Iraq. But our objectives remain the same.
Finally, one Iraqi tactic lay in ruins today. Syria rejected Saddam Hussein's attempts to split the anti-Baghdad coalition by firing missiles at Israel. The war in the Gulf, said Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk al-Sharrah, has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Strategically, this setback might outweigh all of Saddam Scud's success stories. I'm Dave Marish for Nightline in Washington.
When Israelis are told to put on their gas masks, and they heard that command again tonight, the messenger is Nachman Shai, the chief spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces. Brigadier General Shai joins us now live from Tel Aviv. To what degree is this wearing on civilian morale, General Shai?
Well, for the time being, I believe the Israel public managed to behave itself during those horrible minutes and sometimes hours of waiting in those sealed rooms while gas masks are on, because they know very well there is a good reason for that.
But inevitably, it must be costing sleep, it must be wearing on nerves. Do you have any idea whether people are still going to work at the same rate? Are the schools open, closed?
Yes, we are quite surprised of the reaction of the Israeli public so far, but you know Israel very well. We are immune, in a way, to all kinds of wars, including this one, which is new to us, but at the same time we have been exposed for a long time to all kinds of terrorist activities, including those targeted to our civilian population. So this time it's not Kiryat Shmona in the north, it's Tel Aviv in the center part of the country. But let me tell you that the public is back in work. Just the day after the second missile attack, people went back to work, and this coming Sunday we start renewing schools, opening high schools already, and gradually we'll get to the entire educational system.
Can you tell me technically, obviously without revealing any military secrets, just how does it work before you go on the radio or have one of your people go on the radio and announce that there is an alert and tell people what to do? What is the process on sort of a minute-by-minute basis?
What we do is that we get an alert which is based on some signs that a missile or some missiles will launch out of western Iraq. That means that we have few minutes to alert the entire population. At that moment, exactly, sirens are sounded all over the country, and people are asked quietly to get into their sealed rooms, to put their gas mask on, and to wait. At that moment, approximately, I'm on the air, and I'm telling them exactly what to do. I myself sit in an underground headquarters of the IDF, where usually the defense minister, the chief of the IDF, and some other army generals are sitting as well. They do assess the situation, and I'm the one who delivers the messages from there to the Israeli public and trying to give guidelines and instructions to the Israeli people what to do and how.
Just talk to me for a moment technically about what you think happened today. It appeared from some of that video that we saw earlier that one of the Patriot missiles actually fell back down. Was it onto Tel Aviv? Do you know how and why that happened?
Yes, well, you know, last night, as you mentioned, at least 7 missiles were launched out of Iraq to Israel. Most of them were intercepted or hit in the air by the Patriot missiles. But at the same time, 1 or 2 Patriot missiles missed, and they landed on the ground. We will know later today in the morning what exactly happened and what damage was caused as a result of that missile. But basically it happens while we are, where there are so many targets in the air, and they have to be engaged by quite a number of batteries on the ground.
But it does seem that today's greatest damage may have been done by a Patriot missile falling back on the ground.
No, you are wrong, Ted. No, the damage was made out of a Scud missile which landed somewhere in Israel, and we don't exactly know what kind of the missile, whether it's the entire warhead or part of it. That will be found only later today.
All right, General Shai, thank you very much for joining us. When we return, we'll talk with a journalist who's had relatively free access to Baghdad since the war began. along with a Jordanian scientist monitoring the disastrous effects of the oil being spilled into the Persian Gulf. In Jordan is Lamis Andoni, a correspondent for the Financial Times of London and the Christian Science Monitor. She left Iraq only yesterday. And also joining us from Amman, Dr. Abdullah Toukan, the science advisor to Jordan's King Hussein. Dr. Toukan, I'd like to begin by focusing on that enormous oil spill in the Gulf. We heard some fairly sanguine comments before, suggesting that were it not for war, this sort of a spill could be contained. But we are at war. What is likely to happen as millions of gallons of that oil keep being pumped into the Gulf every day?
Oh, I think you're going to have quite an environmental catastrophe over in that region. You see, Ted, the Gulf itself is an enclosed sea. It's about 600 miles long by about 50 to 220 miles wide. It's a shallow water, about 110 feet. And the currents there are counterclockwise. Now, if you compare to the oil spill that happened in 1983 during the Iraq-Iran war, when the Nowruz field and the Ardashir fields spilled only 2 million barrels of oil. Here we're talking at the initial stage of 3 million, and might even go up to maybe 10 million if this goes on for a couple of days. In 1983, there was quite a devastation of the marine life there. Sea turtles, sea snakes, finfish, part of the shrimp industry was completely devastated. And then apparently some of the oil slick had gone down the coast of Saudi Arabia, reached to Al Khobar desalination plant, which was forced to shut down for about a week.
Well, you brought me to exactly the point that I wanted to raise with you, namely those desalination plants are providing the vast majority of water for all the troops in Saudi Arabia. So what's going to happen if the oil gets down to the desalination plants?
Well, actually, the desalination plants, if the oil gets in there and starts clogging it up, then they'll have to shut down, not even temporary, for good. And not only that, you have a large number of industries there as well. And there are some power units over there. So really, Dhahran itself, in addition to the United States troops, will not have any water at all. Industrial facilities, heavy industry facilities, will be affected. Yeah. So both put together, you will have a problem.
Now, I find myself somewhat confused by the fact that we just heard General Kelly before saying that he couldn't see any sort of military implication here. What you're telling me sounds like a rather serious military implication.
Well, it's really, you know, the military experts can give you their point of view, but, you know, one has to look for the reason for the spillage of oil. If they think that they can contain it before it spreads too far, or they can contain it at the place where they think they can do the marine landing, then obviously they should know better. But it would surprise me if they can get in their containment booms, their skimmers, right into the combat zone and try to work it over there while the hostilities are taking place.
Now, obviously, and I'd like to turn now to Ms. Andoni, obviously Saddam Hussein is striking out in any way he can, in large measure, because I'm sure he feels enormous frustration at the way that the bombers and the fighter jets are getting through over almost every part of Iraq. You have been where over the past few days?
I've been at Rashid Hotel.
In Baghdad?
Yes, in Baghdad. But I was mobile.
You were mobile, meaning what? How far?
Well, I went around Baghdad, and on my way out, I went to 2 villages as well.
So what can you tell us about what you've seen?
Well, the destruction is widening. In Baghdad, they're mainly hitting public buildings, government buildings, and communication centers. But recently, the more civilian buildings are being hit. I've seen at least 2 big buildings.
And what about the morale of the people?
Well, at the beginning, the Iraqis were in a state of shock and they were taken aback. But by the 4th day, confidence was building up and it was turning into a mood of defiance and resolve, and anti-U.S. were running very high when I left.
Anti-U.S. feeling manifesting itself how?
Well, when you talk to people, I went to different areas like Kazimiya, Azamiya. These are very crowded areas, poor areas in Baghdad. And I talked to people there, and they were telling me that they were waiting for the Americans and the Allied forces to dare and try to land forces in Baghdad, and because they want to challenge them in a face-to-face battle. And they were telling me that if they capture pilots, they will just kill them. And this is why the Iraqi radio has been issuing daily appeals to people not to hurt pilots, and has announced an award for people who will to give all the pilots alive. And for the Iraqis, regardless of what they think of Saddam, it's an attack against Iraq, and they're driven by their instinct of survival. And this is the main issue now in Baghdad, that Baghdad is being hit, their existence is being threatened, and they're rallying behind Saddam regardless of the criticisms that they sometimes, and I heard many criticisms of the way he runs the country, and they're more open about it now. They think that if he survives and the country survives, he has to, and they have to have freedom. But at this stage, they think that he has emerged, they talk about him as a symbol for their struggle for survival, the survival of Iraq. It's more important for them than Saddam and what he does, or than Kuwait. Kuwait, at this point, when I talk to people in Iraq, and some of them say that Saddam was wrong in going to Kuwait, they even say that loud now, that at this stage it's becoming irrelevant, especially as the bombardments continue and more people are getting hurt.
Ms. Andoni and Dr. Toukan, thank you both very much for joining us. In our attempt to bring you timely information on the Gulf War, we've inundated you with a good many facts and figures over the last 10 days, so when we come back, a review and an explanation of what you've been hearing. So far, to help us add a little order to what may at times seem chaotic, here's Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
How do you get a grip on what has happened these last 9 days? How do you escape from the trap of sensory overload, from the feeling of being overwhelmed by everything you've seen and heard? Well, one way, one very distinctly American way, is to measure what has happened, to put numbers on these events. So that's what we've tried to do. Since the start of the war, Allied planes have made a total of 17,500 sorties. That's a fancy name for one round-trip flight. On Thursday, they flew 2,707, the biggest number of sorties of any single day. About half of them have been combat missions. The Allies have lost a total of 17 aircraft so far. 10 of those lost planes are American. The total cost of the 10, $213 million. The single most expensive lost plane is the F-14A at $38 million for one plane. The Iraqis have lost 19 planes in air-to-air combat. No cost figures available. In human costs, 14 Americans are now listed as missing in action. There is no count of dead or wounded Iraqis, but the Allies have captured at least 86 prisoners. In the high-tech battlefield, at least 230 cruise missiles have been fired at Iraq. Each one costs $1.3 million, not counting research and development costs. By latest count, the Iraqis have fired a total of 43 Scud missiles, 23 against Saudi Arabia, 20 against Israel. All of this is being covered by a regiment of journalists, 891 of them in Saudi Arabia alone, 110 more in Dubai. These numbers do not include the troops, that's what the network calls them, the troops, who are in New York and Washington and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Amman, Jordan, and all the other places from which this war is being covered. The coverage has, of course, dominated the airwaves. NBC alone has added 44 hours of special news programming to its coverage since the war began. That's cost a huge amount of money. Just in these 9 days, ABC, CBS, and NBC have canceled more than $30 million worth of advertising due to increased news coverage. The print press, too, has been affected by the war. The press run of the Los Angeles Times is up by some 46,000 copies a day. The New York Post is up 50,000 a day. Along with increased attention has come increased tension, fears about security. American Airlines, for example, says its business to Europe is down 40% since the Gulf War began due to cancellations. Calls to the Chicago bomb squad usually run 1 a day. Since the war started, they're running 10 a day. In New York, the daily number of calls to the bomb squad has gone from 14 to 102. In Tampa, Florida, Sunday's Super Bowl will be played under the eyes of more than 2,000 security people. Every routine seems to be changing. At the Pentagon, Domino's Pizza usually delivers 3 a day. In the first day after the war, the number hit 125. Pizza deliveries have now been stopped for security reasons. Of course, we can't know how many questions our children have asked about what is going on, how many hours of sleep have been lost to our fears, how many tears have been shed for the lives lost and those still at risk. There are some things we don't know how to measure. Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
And speaking of children, as Jeff was just a moment ago, I'll be back with an important program note after this. On the war in the Gulf. Peter Jennings and ABC correspondents will answer questions phoned in beginning at 10:30 Eastern Time, 7:30 in the morning Pacific. And then on Sunday, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Aarons and White House Chief of Staff John Sununu will be the guests on This Week with David Brinkley. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been Nightline.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
This is ABC, home.
And I'm Ana Chavez. An elite squad of environmental warriors has arrived in the Gulf tonight. Their mission to contain, disperse, or slow the world's largest oil spill. It's now described as covering an area 10 by 40 square miles. And to give you an idea of the monumental effort ahead, here is what that same spill would look like superimposed on the Bay Area. Some parts of the slick are said to extend 85 miles, and remember, it is still spreading. Richard?
The U.S. military is being cautious about the success of the air war against Iraq tonight. Today, the Pentagon admitted that after 24,000 air sorties against Iraq, Saddam Hussein still has large parts of his military machine intact. And part of that machine is now in Iran. More than 80 Iraqi planes have fled the fight. Speculation is that Saddam Hussein is trying to save the best aircraft from the bombing. Iran has said it will keep the planes and pilots until after the war. The fear is that Iran may allow the planes to re-enter the fight, and that would change the face of the battle completely. The other part of the Hussein war machine that still plagues the coalition, the Scud launchers. At the beginning, it was thought there would be 50 or so launchers. Now it seems there could be hundreds. A photo taken in a 1989 Iraqi weapons fair shows a Scud on a mobile launcher. The launcher was made in Iraq. The trucks are Swedish, purchased during the 1980s. Experts think that Iraq may have as many as 6,000 trucks.
What this means is that the Iraqis potentially have the capability to carry on building mobile missile launchers just as fast as they're being knocked out.
And there were pictures released by the Iraqis today of casualties being brought into hospitals. It is reported that hospitals are able to cope with the injured because all surgeries prior to the war were postponed to conserve supplies.
At least one international humanitarian appeal has apparently been heard in Iraq, where for the first time in a week, the Iraqi border with Jordan has been opened, and thousands of refugees are being allowed to leave.
I spent 1 week in my car. Yeah, I slept in my car, and we had no food.
Reports of refugee illnesses and deaths are not uncommon. The International Red Cross reports that Jordanians, Palestinians, Kuwaitis, Africans, and Asians have been lined up at the border for days. Many of them had to pay $1,000 for a tank of gas in Iraq, where gas sales have been banned because of the war. Originally, Iraq had told many of these refugees they would have to drive all the way back to Baghdad for visas. After international appeals, that visa requirement was dropped.
The world is still waiting for Israel to respond to the Scud missile attacks. So far, all have gone unanswered militarily. But senior Israelis say a response will eventually come. Tonight, a retired Israeli brigadier general was in the Bay Area talking about just that. Ed Leslie reports.
The Israeli military is well known around the world as a daunting force capable of going after Iraqi missile batteries. 1/3 of the troops are women, and the woman who led them for 5 years before recently retiring is former Brigadier General Amira Dotan, who arrived tonight for her UC Berkeley speech looking more like an English professor among heavy security. Cal students wanted to know, among other things, about a possible Israeli retaliation for Iraqi missile attacks.
But what about them saving face if they, do not retaliate? Then countries such as Syria will say, well, hey, maybe we can bomb them, and they're not going to retaliate. Is there any feeling that if we don't show them that we're going to fight back like we always have?
Just try for yourself, with your friend, with your enemy. You are going in the campus and he is going to give you a slap on your face. What are you going to do? Okay, so this is today. Tomorrow, in the afternoon, again, another slap. Okay? Maybe this out, maybe all the aggression went out. The third day, another slap. And your aggression is starting to really becoming very accumulative, okay? So it's the part of what you said, and the part of it is just being a person.
General Dotan, who was the world's highest-ranking female soldier, was invited to speak by Cal's Israel Action League. At UC Berkeley, Ed Leslie, Channel 7 News Tonight.
Our Gulf War coverage continues from the home front. A Bay Area Marine becomes a casualty in the war in the Mideast.
San Francisco Mayor Art Agnes has a warning for anyone planning on committing a hate crime.
And we'll look at how California is changing. You'll see the boom counties and the boom towns of the 1990s. And the cleanup effort now underway in Saudi Arabia. Of course, KGO Radio's Greg Jarrett is in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. He joins us now, where we understand that there are experts just returning from their first survey of the spill. Greg?
That's right, Anna. Those who go to the furthest point possible in northeast Saudi Arabia, that is Khafji, say it's the worst example of ecological disaster they have ever seen. Worse even than the initial reports that we had gotten in yesterday. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here, and the experts flown in from all over the world agree with reporters and say they will do what they can to alleviate the worst spill ever. But local oil patch old-timers, those who've been working in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait for the last 20 or 30 years, say that really isn't going to be much. Word is here in Saudi Arabia that if Saddam Hussein wishes, he still has many more options for dumping greater amounts of oil into the Gulf. In fact, one expert here told me it could literally become the Black Sea instead of the Persian Gulf, black with oil from Kuwait.
Greg, let's talk about ground troops for a moment. Now that they're getting set up in their positions and they're moving up towards the front, what's the attitude? What's the feeling and the mood among the troops?
Well, the waiting is wearing on them, as you can possibly imagine. And another thing that is wearing on them is the lack of a good meal. I mean, if there's one thing that you'd like to have at the end of a hard, dusty, cold day along a border front waiting to be shot at, it would be a nice, steaming hot meal. Unfortunately, when they moved forward, most of them left their cooks behind along with their kitchens. So they're eating T rations and those MREs that you've heard about instead of A rations, which are hot meals. And that, just about more than anything else, is wearing thin on their nerves.
Greg, can you tell us whether there's any increased anxiety? We've heard something of a pause in the Scud missile attacks. Any other fears?
Yes, there is. As a matter of fact, normally the trip to my office where I broadcast to you from near the airport takes me 15 minutes from my hotel. This morning it took over an hour and 15 minutes because of additional roadblocks being set up. There is obviously increased fear of terrorism here. I was searched by a soldier who's known me for the past 3 weeks and known me very well. Didn't even smile and say hi to me. He went through my bags, through my coat, and through my car with a fine-tooth comb. There's obviously a lot of tension here over the possibility of attack by ground from terrorists.
Thank you, Greg Jarrett, reporting live. Of course, you can hear Greg's report on KGO Radio in the mornings as well.
On the home front, the Gulf War has become tragically personal for a Bay Area family tonight. They're mourning the death of Marine Staff Sergeant Michael Connor, who died Saturday in a vehicle accident following a skirmish with Iraqi troops along the Kuwaiti border. The 32-year-old Marine comes from a large family. There are 2 other children in the Marines.
Michael is in a good place, and he's safe. My heart, though, goes out to all of the other families.
Connor leaves a wife and 2 children in Fremont. 2 other Marines were also killed in that same collision, and 7 soldiers were injured.
Police in Washington, D.C. are busy tonight tightening up security around the Capitol building. They're taking extra precautions for President Bush's State of the Union address tomorrow night. This morning, in a speech to a group of religious broadcasters, the president strongly defended the war in the Gulf as a just war.
The war in the Gulf is not a Christian war, a Jewish war, a Muslim war. It is a just war, and it is a war with which good will prevail.
Later today, Secretary of State James Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Besmersnyk held a news conference. They announced that Bush and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev had agreed to postpone next month's Moscow summit.
The war in the Gulf, just oil spill. An air raid apparently disabled the pumping station that fueled it for more than a week. And more than 80 Iraqi planes have fled into neighboring Iran. The question now becomes, have they defected, or are they preparing for a sneak attack? And on the opposite side of the country, the Iraqi-Jordanian border has reopened, allowing thousands of refugees to flee to safety.
That is our news for tonight. Thanks for watching.
Enough to do something about it, it gets shot down.
But is Saddam Hussein rebuilding his war machine as fast as Allied planes knock it out? And the Moscow summit is postponed. Are U.S.-Soviet relations beginning to sour? We'll talk with the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington with the latest on the Gulf War, Ted Koppel.
A new ABC News Washington Post poll underlines what may be President Bush's biggest problem. 8 out of 10 Americans seem to be generally satisfied with the progress of the war in the Persian Gulf, and most give the president high marks for his handling of the war. Only 1 of 10 people in the poll, however, thinks the economy is improving, and only 45% of the public feels the president is doing a good job in his approach to the economy. And if things take a turn for the worse in the war, or if, as one major newspaper reported this morning, things are not going as well in the war as we have been led to believe, support for the president may undergo significant erosion across the board. You might not think that one story in one newspaper could have such an impact, but when the paper is the Washington Post and the reporter is Bob Woodward, he of Woodward and Bernstein Watergate fame, one story can cause a lot of ripples. Here's more from Dave Marish.
Holy crap. For the love of... Stop it! Give me that phone. What a break. On the wire, I got a flashpoint.
It's every journalist's dream, the story that moves the world. On the front page of today's Washington Post, Bob Woodward had a story that moved part of the world, the part inhabited by other journalists.
General, the Washington Post is reporting today that...
Every place news people were asking questions of military people today, Woodward's article was cited.
An American newspaper overnight reported that the estimates of runways that have been taken out so far has been exaggerated.
Woodward, a Pulitzer Prize winner and co-author of the stories that toppled President Nixon, packs a wallop, and so do some of the points he made in this morning's paper. That 65% of Iraqi airfields are still operable, that 8,000 to 9,000 Iraqi anti-aircraft emplacements have survived intact, that Iraqi supply lines are largely unaffected by the bombing, and where Scud missile launchers are concerned...
...that you've only taken out 8 out of the 30 fixed sites. What do you have to say about that?
What I have to say about that is that all 30 fixed sites have been attacked and hit. Some of them have been totally destroyed. We have re-hit some of them.
From the data we're getting, it would indicate that the weapons may not be as effective as we hoped. On the other hand, some of the things like the Woodward article imply a level of effectiveness that military planners never expected in the first place.
Part of the problem, says weapons designer and analyst Pierre Spray, is that visible damage can be less damaging than it looks.
We spent all of World War II poring over extraordinarily similar photographs, trying to figure out whether we had or had not destroyed a given factory. The simple fact of the matter was that in totally ruined-looking factories, the Germans produced about 4 times as many airplanes in 1944 as they did in 1942.
So could the briefers of the Gulf War be creating a credibility gap?
Well, I think that's what the administration's been trying to avoid in its earliest briefings, stressing that these are very preliminary results, that there's a long war ahead.
In Riyadh, that was exactly the bottom-line message correspondent Barry Dunsmore drew from today's often contentious briefings.
I am sure that in the first few days, many people here hoped that the war could be won in the air. I think it's quite clear now they are resigned to having to finish the war on the ground.
In the Gulf War, few reporters are within hundreds of miles of where the main action is. This increases reporters' suspicions that they're being told less than the full story. And it's only cold comfort that the briefers offering the official story of the war are themselves no closer to the battlefront or to the true facts of what's going on there. I'm Dave Marish for Nightline in Washington.
To help sort out some of those facts, two defense analysts with special expertise in the Gulf will join us in a moment. Then later, the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry will be here to discuss today's postponement of the U.S.-Soviet summit. And we will also be speaking with the president's domestic policy advisor on how Washington deals with pressing domestic issues during times of international crisis. That has been a defense analyst and consultant to the defense and intelligence community for more than 20 years. He is a specialist in Middle East and Persian Gulf military issues and co-authored one of the definitive books on the Iran-Iraq War. Mr. Wagner joins us from Los Angeles. And here in Washington, military analyst Michael Dunn, who is currently lecturing at Georgetown University on Middle East defense. Mr. Dunn, Bob Woodward is a first-class reporter who I'm sure is reporting accurately what his sources at the Pentagon and in the intelligence community are telling him. So what is the public supposed to conclude when it's hearing one thing from that kind of source and yet another thing in the public briefing?
Well, I think you have to look at the evidence, Ted, and the evidence is that we've had 3 days without a loss. We lost a Harrier the last day, but for 3 days prior to that, we hadn't lost a single aircraft. The number of sorties which had been flown so far, one would have expected to have lost somewhere between 70 and 100 aircraft at a minimum. It reminds me of Sherlock Holmes' remark about the dog that didn't bark in the nighttime.
Yeah, except it seems to me that you're reaching conclusions which you may or may not be justified in reaching. If, for example, Saddam Hussein is husbanding his resources because he wants to bring them into play somewhat later in the war, that would make all of your speculation fruitless, wouldn't it?
Well, if he's husbanding his resources and he's keeping them in an earthquake-prone China cabinet, then he's going to lose them. If he's moved them into Iran, and Iran is telling the truth when it says that they will be interned there and they will not be allowed to fly, then he's putting them out of the war. And they're as effectively out of the war for now as if they were knocked out of the sky. If he's keeping them in his hardened shelters, then the same thing basically applies. Gradually, we are going to destroy those hardened shelters one by one, and he's going to lose his aircraft. He is not going to have his runways forever. If 65% of his airfields are still operational, that means that 35% of them have been destroyed, which is a third of his airfields. He has 66 or so major airfields available.
But the point, Mr. Wagner, forgive me if I jump back and forth rather quickly, but we have a relatively small amount of time here, is that the Air Force was under the impression that it had destroyed a great many more than simply 35% of his airfields, and that he appears to be repairing them almost as fast as we're taking them out, if Bob Woodward's story is accurate.
I think there's probably a good bit of truth in what Bob's reporting, and I'm not sure that that's greatly different from what's being reported by the military. I think the fact of the matter is that the United States Air Force and the British allies and the Saudis have been very effective in causing temporary damage to a substantial number of airfields. They've had good briefings and reports on the cratering of the runways, but it's also been widely reported that within some relatively short amount of time, the Iraqis have been fairly good about going out with quick patch cement and restoring the runways. It's not a very high technology problem. Craters and runways can, in fact, be repaired in not large amounts of time. And
when we hear, for example, as we heard General Kelly today suggesting that most of the fixed Scud missile launchers had been taken out, and then a question is raised as to whether, in fact, they have been taken out or just damaged. Again, the suggestion in Bob Woodward's article was that a great many of those fixed launchers are still operational.
I think that the suggestion in the article was that a number of the Scud launchers were still operational. I'm not sure how good the information is on the fixed launchers. I think the residual problem is probably with the mobiles, and that's been the subject of discussion for some days. I think what we found just after the outset of war is that the number of Scud launchers, particularly on the mobile side, was far larger than had been previously anticipated, and they're working to deal with it, but there's still a number of launchers left and probably quite a number of Scuds available.
Mr. Dunn, let me raise a question with you that relates back to those aircraft, somewhere between 80 and 100 of them that have now been moved into Iran. You're quite right when you say that the Iranians have said they're out of the war, they're neutral, but there was an if connected to that, and that is if the Israelis for some reason become involved, then the Iranians have already said that they will come into the war on the side of Iraq. in which case, presumably, those aircraft will all become operational again.
Well, it conceivably could happen, but at the same time, it's a very dangerous thing for Iran to do. It's almost suicidal, given the condition of their own armed forces, to take on a 28-nation coalition, or it'd be 29 nations if Israel comes in. On the other hand, it is quite true that the aircraft which Iraq has moved to Iran is some of its best air defense aircraft and some of its best anti-fleet aircraft, the F-1s with their Exocets, which could threaten the fleet in the Gulf. So certainly, obviously, the coalition forces have to pay very close attention to what those aircraft are doing and make sure that they are, in fact, neutrally interned and not available for combat.
Mr. Wagner, quickly, your thoughts on those aircraft in Iran?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. You know, precisely why have the aircraft gone there? And I think we just don't have an answer for that yet. There's one argument that has a plausible scenario that after a peace or a settlement of the immediate war, then Saddam would in fact have an air force available to him, and they could be returned after some sort of a peace. But the precise reason as to why he either ordered them moved there or they went there without his direct orders, we're just going to have to wait and see. I just don't think we have an accurate answer to that yet.
All right, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Dunn, thank you both very much. Not all of today's Washington business dealt with the Gulf War, but that cloud was never far away. The U.S.-Soviet summit, scheduled for February, was in part postponed this afternoon because of the war. When we return, we'll be joined by the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry, Vitaly Churkin.
Oh, 5 more minutes. It's our anniversary. Let's call in sick.
Can't.
Oh, 10 years deserves something.
True.
Haven't I made you coffee for 10 years?
Haven't I had to drink it? Now, come on.
Why?
Show your friends this. Happy anniversary.
Oh, it's beautiful.
The Diamond Anniversary Band. This year. Tell her you'd marry her all over again.
Okay, I'll show him. Tomorrow.
LensCrafters made me these wonderful top-quality glasses and got me back on track in about an hour.
LensCrafters puts the whole lab right in the store to custom craft your top-quality glasses in about an hour. Call LensCrafters at 1-800-522-LENS.
You know, that sign wasn't up there for more than 3 days. And bingo.
I've never seen a house move so fast. I've never seen a real estate outfit move so fast.
We're prepared to get the results you're looking for. The Prudential. You know us. We know real estate.
A sports car. I really want a sports car.
Buying a new car can be very confusing.
Or the banks. Should I lease? Should I buy? I don't know. I'm clueless.
How do you know which options are best?
Wire wheel covers. Good, good, good. Stereo.
Find out the do's and don'ts when making deals on wheels.
I can't afford you, pal. What about a nice sedan?
A Channel 7 Bay Area Focus, Wednesday at 6.
Welcome to El Torito's Sizzling Fajitas Fiesta. Our famous steak or chicken fajitas with your choice of a taco, an enchilada, taquitos, and more, all for just $7.95. Our sizzling fajitas combinations. When we're hot, we're hot. Get free nachos with any of El Torito's $7.95 fajita combos.
Hey, how you doing?
Look what I do in school today, Grandpa.
The heart, the aorta, the left and right ventricles, and the auricles.
Grandpa, did you want to be a doctor when you were little?
Well, dreams need never again be forgotten.
You would have been the best doctor, Grandpa.
Please support the United Negro College Fund.
Can I be a doctor, Grandpa?
Prime time, behind the scenes in the Gulf War, when news really matters. Diane Sawyer, Sam Donaldson. Prime time, Thursday.
Watch Good Morning America for continuing coverage of Operation Desert Storm.
With full reports from ABC News, join us here on Good Morning America.
When Soviet Foreign Minister Besmetnik emerged from his meeting with President Bush this afternoon, he and Secretary of State Baker issued a short statement explaining why the February summit had been postponed.
The Gulf War makes it inappropriate for President Bush to be away from Washington. In addition,
work on the START treaty will require some additional time. Both presidents...
In spite of the inappropriateness of the timing, the Soviet crackdown in the Baltics has raised questions about a possible cooling in what was otherwise the warmest relationship the two countries have shared in post-war history. Joining us live in our Washington Bureau is Vitaly Churkin, the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Is it time for American anchormen to start beating up on Soviet spokesmen again, Mr. Churkin?
I don't think so. I think that our relations are still on track, and there have been some developments which could have created difficulties, but basically the way the two sides have responded to those developments show that we have a lot of common interest and a solid basis for that relationship.
Now, on the one side, when you talk about those developments, you could be referring, for example, to the Persian Gulf and the way things are going, and perhaps the fact that the United States is focusing more on attacking Iraq than the Soviet Union had wanted. To what degree did that come up today?
It did come up to a very small degree, because I don't think there is much of a difference between us on that. We have expressed our concern that the logic of war might bring about a situation where people forget about the original goal of the United Nations activities, and that is the liberation of Kuwait, and some other much more far-reaching goals might come up, which would entail greater destruction and more casualties. But there was an important statement this morning by President Bush, who again re-emphasized that the goal was that of liberating Kuwait, and that the United States did not try to bring things farther than that. So basically there is no argument.
Now, you know and I know that what you're talking about there is the word that has been wafting around in a number of different ways over the past couple of weeks, suggesting that maybe the United States was looking toward toppling or maybe even killing Saddam Hussein. Was anyone so indelicate as to put that in precise language today?
No, and besides, what we were expressing our concern was something broader than that. It was the destruction of a country, of Iraq, and we were simply bringing back the idea of the original purpose of the United Nations actions. And we have a good understanding now between the United States and the Soviet Union on that.
Now, on the other development, which was sort of fuzzed over, at least in the public statements, is clearly the activities of Soviet police and Soviet military in Lithuania and in the Baltics in general. Was there any specific discussion of that today, and did you have the impression that while this may be an appropriate time for the summit to be postponed because of the war, that at least factored into it?
I did not have such an impression, but there was an extensive discussion of that, and we again reiterated that it was the purpose of the President to see to it that the situation there is resolved peacefully according to the Constitution, in a way where the rights of the national minorities and social groups, all the social groups there, would be upheld. So basically there is another case of good understanding, mutual understanding on a difficult issue.
There is a growing sense, as you know, in this country that President Gorbachev is becoming more and more pressured by the right wing to move himself toward the right, and that in fact he is doing so.
Well, President Gorbachev continues to be committed to the program of reform, but you're right that there is a lot of pressure on him from all the sides. So he's in a very difficult position, and in a situation where everybody should be very careful in responding to whatever developments might take place in our country.
When you're talking about everyone, you mean the United States should not be as critical? Was that message conveyed to the President? And if so, how did he respond?
Not in specific terms. We were not criticizing the response of the United States specifically, but basically, as you know, there has been some rather strong reaction in the West, and we do feel that in some cases that was overreaction, that they hastened to certain conclusions which were not timely, and that their response did not take into account the whole picture of the situation in the Baltics, and most particularly in Lithuania, which is not as simple as some people think it is at all.
I know it's not easy to designate these things numerically, but if U.S.-Soviet relations 6 months ago were, let's say, at an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you say they are now?
Well, I don't know. I would simply say that we're still on track, and we come out from this meeting hopeful that we can continue with that. One important result, incidentally, is that they agreed that they should continue vigorously to work on the START treaty, and we hope that in February the basic work would be completed.
Mr. Churkin, I know it's been a long day. Thank you very much for coming so late. Appreciate it. When we return, we'll focus on how Washington deals with pressing domestic issues that appear to be eclipsed by the current international crisis.
What would it take to get you to change from Advil or Tylenol? How about something new from Bayer? New Bayer Plus with Stomach Guard. It's got it all. Bayer Plus has Bayer aspirin for powerful pain relief. To bang back headaches, muscle aches, and minor arthritis pain. And New Bayer Plus has more. Stomach Guard to help prevent stomach upset. So bang pain back with New Bayer Plus. The wonder drug worth trying. It's tough on pain, gentle on your stomach.
Ford profiles in quality, protecting your investment.
It's really upsetting when something chips the paint on your new car. So today, we're demonstrating a remarkable chip-resistant spray we now apply at the factory to the critical areas of all our American-built cars.
Half this test hood was sprayed with it, half was not. Look for yourself. You can see the difference.
When your goal is to build the highest quality cars and trucks in the world, you don't do it any other way.
At Ford Motor Company, quality is job one.
Guess what? I don't have the keys.
I don't have them either.
The side door.
The gleam of a brass chandelier. Not open.
The window.
The embrace of a comfortable chair. The 100 other details that make an Ethan Allen house so nice to come home to. If you ever get home. Maybe the garage.
Yeah.
Right now, there's a sale going on at your Ethan Allen gallery.
In the jungle, among the money funds, there is only one king. Dreyfus Worldwide Dollar for the lion's share.
And Nissan wins the score. Baja Internacional here in Ensenada.
Another first for Nissan at the HDRA fireworks.
Once again in Las Vegas, the winner is Nissan. And the competition eats dust.
If you want the dirt on 4x4, Nissan's SE V6 King Cab boasts the most powerful import brand V6 in its class.
Gold Coast 300 is history, and the winner is Nissan.
No wonder it's cleaning up.
Nissan, and it's not even close.
Nissan, it's more than a truck. It's an attitude.
We are not going to screech everything to a halt on terms of our domestic agenda.
The campaign is progressing as it's planned and in accordance with the desires of the president, and will execute the orders as he dictates.
In Henry V, Shakespeare wrote, "In peace, there is nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears," he wrote, "the man should imitate a tiger." Well, the president is trying to imitate both man and tiger, and so is much of Washington. But the blast of war is very loud here. To move around, the president uses decoy helicopters to confuse possible assassins. Decoy limousines have been added to the presidential motorcade.
I am not going to screech my life to a halt out of some fear about Saddam Hussein.
Despite the sense of war in Washington, the life of government does go on. Workers do arrive from the suburbs. The cabinet does attack the paper flow. At the Commerce Department today, Secretary Robert Mosbacher was meeting with advisors. At Health and Human Services, Secretary Louis Sullivan was hard at work. At Education, the acting secretary, John Sanders, was in his office. And for all these days, the president has been in and out of his office, trying, he says, to balance the business of the country.
We will have a briefing on the number one issue of the day, the Gulf crisis. We'll probably be talking about events inside the Soviet Union that concern all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike. And then we'll focus in on the domestic agenda.
If you look at the last 5 or 6 months, you would see that there's a very good balance in most of the meetings and things that have occurred in the White House as far as policy decisions.
How about the last one that you went to? Do you remember roughly what?
Well, I would say that it probably was probably 70-30 national security versus domestic.
When the dust of the Cold War cleared last year, there was great hope the United States could find a way to solve its own problems. the savings and loan mess, the specter of recession, violent crime, and urban decay. These problems are still visible, but war blocks much of what the president sees on his desk.
You have a little extra measure of clout in a foreign policy crisis to say, now wait a minute. The president is focused on the Persian Gulf. The president is focused on policy for pursuing the war. You really want to spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about X or Y. Can it hold?
But if X or Y are savings and loan or the budget deficit, what then?
The new